Then, so I have a script with me. The apologies that I am going to read through it and hopefully keep to good time. So I will keep an eye on my watch here as well. So modern maps then allow us to trace the course of boundaries as dotted lines in the landscape. Let me just get that back up. Here we have the dotted lines that I'm talking of. This is Norfolk, Corston in Norfolk, running up the side here all the way up to the top, and other dotted lines across here. Unusual and intriguing place names often stand out for us, which has led to some extreme field work. So here we have the stump cross showing on this map. I apologize for the interference here, sorry. Let me just, there we go. So a rummage through the brambles and undergrowth can certainly be lucrative in revealing some very ancient features of the landscape that are still existing in the landscape today, marking parish boundaries. However, as Oliver Rackham has reminded us, it has long been the custom of officialdom to while away idle hours by tidying boundaries and removing enclaves, meanders, etc. These tinkerings, though seldom of practical advantage, destroy some of the meaning which has to be recovered from 19th century maps. Even the first edition 25-inch Ordnance Survey does not always show the true course of boundaries. Indeed, the boundaries traced as dotted lines on OS maps belies a long history of boundary making and unmaking, ambiguity and controversy. The history of parish boundaries reveals that routes and markers mattered not only to tithe owners, but to the wider community of householders, tenants and commoners. So that my following discussion then is about this interconnection of interests that took material form in the landscape in treading out parish boundaries. Certainly in British landscape archaeology and history, little work has been carried out on the post-medieval and early modern meanings of boundaries. The majority of research has tended to focus on the origins of features, with particular interest in deciphering the very earliest origins. Work in this area has emphasised long-term patterns of continuity. I'm thinking in particular of Bonnie's work in Wessex, for example, but we might also include here Margaret Gelling's work and also Angus Winchester's on the northwest area of Britain. So a substantial portion of boundaries, or at least sections of them, were inherited from very ancient patterns of territorial division. It is generally accepted by the 16th century, at least, boundaries were fixed in place, with the number of parishes and their boundaries remaining broadly consistent until the local government reforms of the 19th century. Indeed, writing in the 19th century, Maitland noted how parish boundaries seem to draw themselves. The precedence given to researching the origins of jurisdictional boundaries has led to a general lack of interest in the significance of boundary making in later historic periods. One writer has recently argued that boundary problems caused by tithe disputes continued to arise throughout the Middle Ages, but generally ceased to be of importance after the Reformation. Yet, on closer inspection, the sheer number of court cases brought before the church and equity courts indicate tithe disputes did not end with the Reformation, and nor did local tensions over the true and correct course of boundaries. When studied at the local level, surviving map and court records reveal the early modern history of parish boundaries to be of a significant part of local identity and parish politics. From this perspective, there is a history of early modern landscapes to be written that is not about enclosure, and I think we're very familiar with the enclosure story, but rather we can actually think about an alternative and just as important history of the parish that is actually about boundary making, boundary remaking right across this period. So from the outset, and I suppose today I'm very much focused on my work on Norfolk, I think that the regional dimension to this kind of study is very important and something we might return to later on in our discussion. But just to say from the outset, it is worth noting the complex network of jurisdictional structures inherited from the medieval past. Ecclesiastical territories were part of a complex overlapping web of jurisdictions. The township or the vill, the manor, the parish and the hundred together formed a web of social, economic and political organisation. And I suppose I've argued elsewhere, and I've touched on this today, of course, that it's the process of the early modern period is really characterised by the process of rationalising and consolidating this complex web of boundaries that crisscrossed, in this case, the Norfolk landscape. Taking the long view from the 16th to the 18th century, we can observe a gradual process of rationalisation and consolidation of this territorial complexity. Gradually, the manor and township were superseded by the parish as the primary unit by which local society was organised. This realignment of interest was far from straightforward and varied between regions. Of key interest here is that at the turn of the 17th century, the complexity of jurisdictional landscapes continued to give rise to confusion and disagreement over the correct course of those boundaries. Historians have paid some attention to the origins of this complexity, especially in Norfolk, where manor and parish rarely aligned. The introduction of the tithe system in the 10th century prompted churches to define their geographical territories. But in East Anglia, and in Norfolk in particular, social idiosyncrasies ensured that ecclesiastical arrangements often took an unusual form, with some communities supporting more than one church in the same churchyard. And here I have an image of Reformation in Norfolk, which actually had 3 churches in the same churchyard, one of which is now barely recognisable as a pile of flint in the churchyard. The 2 churches, or 3 churches in this case, in one yard phenomenon was only an extreme version of a much more common occurrence in Norfolk, where a single village with a single name possessed 2 or more parish churches. Evidence suggests that arable lands belonging to each parish could be so intermixed in the open fields so as to render any attempt at perambulating the bounds impractical. And we see this continuing into the 16th and 17th centuries. In Congham, for example, a West Norfolk parish, at the end of Elizabeth's reign, we see that the parish had until the late 16th century been endowed with 3 churches. It was customary for tithes to be divided into 3 equal shares and allocated to each parish accordingly. Among the deponents called to give evidence during the court proceedings, Thomas Scott, for example, suggested that a smaller proportion may have been given to one of the parishes, All Saints, because its inhabitants were fewer and poorer than the parishioners within either of the other 2. Scott went on to say that the certain bounds, metes and limits of the said 3 several parishes have been and yet be unknown or doubtfully known. And we see this right across Norfolk in this period, a large number of court cases, not necessarily dealing with parish boundaries, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but nevertheless sort of detailing this complexity of jurisdictional structure that was inherited from the medieval past. In northwest Norfolk in 1635, during a case concerning the bounds of Burnham Overy, elderly deponents claimed that the perambulation hath not been rightly gone this 80 years. And in Flitcham, which is shown here on this map from the turn of the 17th century, the court was told that Appleton men go in perambulation with Flitcham. Interesting here, a consolidation of interest, that Appleton men will go will join each other in their perambulation with the men of Flitcham for certain parts of the bounds, and so should Newton men join them also. But of late years, the inhabitants of Newton have come further southwards in their perambulations, so not observing the correct course of the parish boundary. The growing authority of the civil parish as a political and administrative jurisdiction in the late Tudor and early Stuart period has been widely noted, especially in the context of the reinvention of rogation-type perambulations and meanings of place, social identity and belonging. I'm interested in pursuing these lines of inquiry by thinking more about the material impact of social processes in shaping the landscape history of the parish. In Norfolk, the 16th century saw a wave of closures of subsidiary, often poorer parish churches and extra parochial chapels, hence my next slide. The period, sorry, excuse me a moment. Yeah, so here we have St. James's in Hunstanton, which was actually a pilgrimage chapel, which is shown here, still extant in the open fields of that parish. Look at this incredible field system. This is very characteristic of northwest Norfolk, showing the roofless chapels still in situ. And of course, it's remembered in the local place names. And this is a map of Newton, which I will talk more about in a moment. But here we have St. Andrew's Church, now a barn, coincidentally occupying the route, providing a boundary mark on the edge of the parish here. This is the procession lane running through it. So an interesting landmark. The period saw the consolidation of parishes and refocus of religious topographies on a single place of worship. In terms of thinking about the spatial reconfiguration of the parish outside the church, this process was significant in providing a central place and basis for the civil functions of the parish as a political and administrative unit, as I've argued elsewhere. In many villages, the reformation of parish landscapes involved far from straightforward attempts to ascertain and fix parish boundaries. Parish boundaries were, of course, important to tithe owners, particularly new lay landowners of monastic lands, but they were also of increasing importance to local communities, local inhabitants. The evidence shows that it was not simply the allocation of tithes, therefore, that caused dispute between neighbouring villages, but also the extent and nature of local customs and rights attached to the commons. Though not as extensive as the large intercommons found in the north and west of the country, considerable tracts of common land shared by more than one manor characterise the Norfolk landscape. It is in these disputes that we find a conflation of interest quite often between the parish and the manor. Early maps and court deposition evidence are invaluable in this regard for revealing how all kinds of structures, natural and archaeological features surviving from multiple pasts were identified, marked, tagged if you like, named and safeguarded for future generations. For a long time now, I've been interested in the dialogue that took place between local inhabitants, households and their interpretations of the material traces of the past in the landscape. Boundary marks were safeguarded through day-to-day observation, being in the landscape, seeing and experiencing, and walking in the company of others. The annual perambulation was important in this regard, but so were everyday practices that wove together a sense of place and customary right through the recognition of landmarks. The evidence suggests that boundaries were marked as a sequence of nodal points, and it was the practice of treading the distance between them that formed the boundary. Thus, a high degree of interpretation was involved, as we see in the case of Flitcham, which is a large area of intercommon shared by, as I've mentioned already, Flitcham inhabitants, Appleton and also Newton, West Newton men. And here we have a number of boundaries crisscrossing the common. So again, Newton men were accused of taking liberty with their perambulation route and treading out a much more southerly path between boundary marks, so therefore encroaching upon the common. Even when parishes were well defined by a feature such as a road or a watercourse, or in this case an extensive earthwork feature, this is actually the Devil's Dyke over the border in Cambridgeshire, which is a long linear feature of early Saxon date, so it is thought. It was called the Devil's Ditch on this map. Certainly in the 16th and 17th century, it was known as the Reach Ditch. It carried the name of the small hamlet of Reach, shown up here. So boundaries in this period then were open to scrutiny and dispute. In the case of the Reach Ditch, as it was known in the 16th century, whether the boundary route lay in the ditch or along the top of the bank was a contentious matter among local inhabitants claiming common grazing rights. In 1586, the court heard how a great ancient bank with a ditch on the west part separated the open fields of the parishes of Swaffham Prior and Burwell, which is shown just up here to the north on the map. According to Robert Manning, a labourer and resident of Burwell, the inhabitants of the town were entitled to take their Rogation-tide procession through the ditch, but poor weather conditions sometimes forced them to walk along the bank. They did go in the bottom of the ditch when the same was dry, but sometimes, though, not often, the same was so wet that they could not go in it. I mean, it's really interesting that they discuss the wetness of it. I mean, this is very chalky soil, so it's very permeable, porous, allowing water through it. So the idea that the ditch was actually very wet seems unlikely. However, this is what the deponents maintained at this time, that because the dampness of the ditch was so great, they were forced to walk along the top of the bank. And John Dawson recalled that the procession usually went along the top of the bank, but in this case, sometimes the wind being so great, those that carried banners were forced to walk in the bottom of the ditch, although the priest always went along the top of the bank, as did he that carried the cross. So we have this sort of ambiguity as to where the course of the boundary actually lay. The Reach Ditch provided common grazing. It mattered therefore whether the boundary lay in the ditch or along the bank, for it delimited the amount of grazing either side could claim. It is in such cases that we find the entanglement of interests, manor and parish, tithe, owner and parishioner, landlord and commoner. So I want to turn now to the choice of boundary feature, and a recurring pattern is the incorporation of ancient landmarks, including prehistoric earthworks, as also pre-Reformation monuments, including the Stantlin Cross shown here, which is actually the stump cross that I showed you earlier, shown on two maps, one from the late 16th century and one from 1674. Clearly it didn't look like either of these. So we find then this incorporation of existing ancient landmark features, which I suppose I've found fascinated in the idea that actually in the court deposition evidence, as historians like Andy Wood have shown, there is a great emphasis placed on the idea of ancient time, a time before anyone could remember. And in my work, I've been really interested in trying to understand this as a way into thinking about the landscape of this period, what was important and meaningful and significant to people at the time. And of course, these ancient features of the landscape signal ancient time, a time before anyone could remember. In court records, so coming back then to my lovely New Buckingham map, in court records concerning New Buckingham and neighbouring Colton from the 1590s, we find illuminating evidence of the continuous process of making boundaries. And I think this is really worth emphasising, that boundaries again, not fixed in this period, but we are looking at a continuous social process of making and remaking, at times unmaking, the course of boundaries. The records of the court are held at the National Archives. The map shown here is held at the Norfolk Records Office. Like many maps of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it was made to show the history of the jurisdictional rights and customs of the manor originating in the medieval past. We see here the depiction of Buckingham Park and Castle, and the planned settlement actually dating to the 12th century, a Norman planned settlement, which is interesting. It is in cases such as this that we find evidence for the complexity of jurisdictional power and authority, and the importance of the past in giving substance to the needs and claims of the present. Shared by neighbours from Carlton and New Buckingham, the common was used as grazing for livestock, gathering fuel, digging for clay and stone, and so forth. Deponents spoke about the Church of St. Martin, depicted here in the centre of the map, being built from the clay and stone dug from the common. The boundary of the common was in dispute. In attempting to prove the boundary across the open common, local inhabitants lay claim to the antiquity of various features, as having existed time out of mind. And in particular, and this goes back to sort of my interest from a while ago now, but in particular, possibly Bronze Age burial mounds. And here we have one just to show you it from Sutton Hoo. My next slide then is a closer detail of the parish boundary shown here, the procession way of New Buckingham, called the Green Way or 100 Mere. Really interesting conflation of jurisdictional topographies going on here. The How Head shown here. The clay pits, the old clay pits, where we hear that clay was dug to build the church, and Old Mill Hill shown here. So two earthwork mounds then, possibly burial mounds surviving from the Bronze Age, were claimed as having special significance. Both were depicted on the map, the Old Mill Hill and How Head. The villagers of Carlton claim the Old Mill Hill as the boundary of their common, while their neighbours from New Buckingham claimed How Head as theirs. It's worth mentioning that the etymology of How Head suggests a burial mound of prehistoric or even Saxon origin. For the inhabitants of New Buckingham, the authenticity of How Head as an ancient boundary marker of the common was given credibility in evidence that it had been used as a meeting place of the medieval 100 Court. John Sharping, a glover of 67 years, remembered his grandfather. So his memory extended across 3 generations, possibly into the early to the mid-15th century. Sharping remembered his grandfather telling him that he had seen the 100 Court meet at How Head on the boundary of Shropham Half Hundred. Others remembered the route of the rogation-type perambulation taking in the Barrow. Thomas Neve, a 76-year-old yeoman, recalled as a boy walking to Buckingham How on the 3rd day of Rogation Week. Peter Collier, a shoemaker aged 66, and Peter Underwood, a 69-year-old mason, both living in New Buckingham, recalled the Rogation-type procession of the bounds stopping to drink beer at How Head, which, as they remembered, was marked the boundary of their common. Minor place names might be easily overlooked as somewhat insignificant in charting historical change across this period. Yet in the production and reproduction of customary landscapes, the physical identifiers of the past provided temporal anchors in the organisation of social memories. Place names did not merely fix or encode meanings in the landscape. Practices of naming and the continuity of certain names evolved from socially embedded memories made over time during routine practices, tending to livestock on the common, as also ritual activities such as Rogation Week. With names being a deliberate matter of contention, a politics of place naming existed within and between village communities. In New Buckingham, an earthwork mound would have certainly provided a convenient location for erecting a mill, for example, making it possible that both sides of the dispute offered up plausible place names. However, each name carried different connotations and was given and was weighted differently before the courts. As an ancient meeting place and administrative boundary mark, How Head suggested longevity and permanence in the landscape. In attempting to claim the authority of the past, alongside the physical qualities of the feature, place names were vital in either authenticating or bringing discredit to the claims to customs and rights being made in the present. The tangible presence of old, crumbling and weathered features originating in a time beyond the lifespan of anyone living connected the lives and actions of former generations of inhabitants to the present. The disappearance, deliberate or accidental, of old landmarks was a matter of some controversy. And so now I turn to another case, this time going back to Corston, where we've seen the image of the stump cross, and to this rather sad tale of the old elm tree, as indicated here, the place where the elm stood. In the village of Corston, at the turn of the 17th century, the fate of the old elm tree became the focus of contention between landowner and villagers. We learn from contemporary court records that the tree had been ordered by the defendant to be cut down, for it narrowed the footpath along which it stood. Presumably in an attempt to appease his neighbours, the owner of the manor and the property, ordered the replacement of the elm with a new boundary or dual stone. So if we move again to the 1674 map, this is the location of the dual stone, and a contentious stretch of brick wall, which I'll come back to. Asked to give evidence before the court commissioners, local inhabitants lamented the loss of the old decayed elm, for it marked the bounds between their village and neighbouring Heveringland and was part of their customary landscape. Local inhabitants related how, over the previous 20 years or so, during Rogation Week, the inhabitants and ministers of Corston walked to the elm and back again, along the footway dividing the defendant's close from the arable open fields of Corston. This route, they claimed, was established in recognition of the disruption caused by the defendant to the ancient perambulation way when he enclosed the grounds environing his house and residence. So, and I think it's here that we can see the old section of the perambulation way, that it still seems to be imprinted in the landscape as conveyed here on the map as a tangible feature of the landscape, but perhaps a hollow way. So local inhabitants related how the route of their perambulation had been disrupted. Evidently, enclosure had obstructed the parishioners' customary right of way. John Sewell recalled how some 25 years previously he had heard Old Loam and Old Bullman say that the Pearl Way dividing Corston and Heveringland did lie through the orchard of the defendant, and so by the back house annexed to his house in Heveringland, and so to the elm. Sewell went on to describe how a wall recently constructed by the defendant so near to the elm tree prevented the parishioners from walking their ancient right of way and from seeing into the orchard. In the village of Corston, memory of the place where the elm once stood served to consolidate and coordinate local sentiment over this small but nevertheless significant restructuring of the customary landscape. And we see that tensions continue to simmer right into the late 17th century over the wall, the perambulation route. Boundaries, therefore, did not simply draw themselves. They did not exist since time immemorial without close attention being paid to their ongoing incorporation in the memory practices of the local community. In many parishes, the social production of parish space drew upon reimagining the late medieval past, a past that could be corroborated in the activity of identifying physical structures on the ground. freestanding crosses. We also find holy wells, ancient trees, and place names surviving in the landscape. In this process, the disparaged rituals and ceremonies of the late medieval church were not simply erased from local memory as throwbacks to an outmoded and redundant past. Rather, they were valuable in establishing the course of boundaries in the present. In a case from New Buckingham, Thomas Neave, 76-year-old yeoman of New Buckingham, told the court that he was a singing boy and used to help sing the procession, while 65-year-old husbandman John Roberts remembered a firkin of beer for the procession of New Buckingham to drink. Thomas Rutland, 68-year-old yeoman from Wyndham, remembered drinking from a handbell. Elite hospitality and the ritualised consumption of food and drink was important for reinforcing memories and the social and cultural obligations expected of local landowners in making such provision. The importance of childhood memories, born of experience, listening to, noting the structures and places that mattered, not just to the community, but the place of individual households, is worth just thinking about in a few minutes, if I may. Importantly, such knowledge was situated in local and familiar landscapes. Among the deponents called to give evidence in New Buckingham, 84-year-old widow Cicely Hunford of Colton Road remembered hearing her grandfather confirm that the wife of one Overton, an inhabitant of New Buckingham, confessed that her husband and bailiff to the lord of the manor had attempted to defraud Carlton of their common by forging a writing describing the boundary. The story handed on from grandfather to granddaughter was made all the more memorable with details of how Overton made the forged document look old by hanging it in the smoke above the fireplace. The deposition evidence suggests the importance of parish bounds then in household memory, so not necessarily just about the community. Old perambulation routes and rituals were remembered as an extension of household space, as the authenticity and power of memory rested on proof of long-term settlement and knowledge of a place and landscape. Memories of old rituals served more than one function. They were used to promote a shared sense of the past against the transgression of time-honoured customs. They also demonstrated within an official arena the longevity of household attachments to space. Among the deponents who recall taking part in rogation-type perambulations, many referred to their parents and grandparents taking them aside and instructing them to remember the bounds. Ritual occasions such as this were opportunities for families to reinforce their knowledge of specific boundary features, particularly those that crossed open areas of common land. Knowledge that was vital, therefore, to the ongoing economic subsistence and social identity of their household units. Economic subsistence was a central matter for concern, realised in access to grazing and fuel upon the commons, as was social place and standing endorsed through long-term settlement. Deponents gave up their experience of rogation tide, and it was by showing subtle differences and nuances in their experiences based on family knowledge handed on from one generation to the next that substantiated their rights to dwell in a place. So the physical traces of the past then were incorporated into ritual and customary practices, for they gave substance and meanings to claims of authenticity and permanence against the reality of constant change in the landscape, whether through natural processes or human intervention. The evidence shows how from one generation to the next memories were threaded together to produce an apparently seamless connection to the past. The landscape and its constituent features provided evidence of a longer history of land use that had existed before anyone could remember beyond the span of generational memory. Furthermore, the appearance of visible decay, veteran trees, weathered stone crosses, denuded earthworks, was interpreted as an indicator of deep time, extending the experience of lived memory into the deep past. The visible signs of ageing in the material world not only corroborated ancestral memory, for it gave credibility to the notion that boundary markers had existed since time immemorial. Put another way, contemporaries were safeguarding an ancient order of landscape and customary practice that was in danger of being eroded by the activities of those who would deny the past. So just to draw this to a conclusion then, it becomes apparent that the tangible evidence of ancient time carried the weight of authority. They were in a sense permanent features of the landscape. The Howe Head trumped the old Mill Hill. The old decayed elm was revered precisely because of its crumbling senescence. Though more usually explored for the medieval and prehistoric periods, in the early period we find that the relics of the past continue to be appropriated and reused for a number of reasons far removed from their original purpose. The tangible presence of old, crumbling and weathered features originating in a time before the lifespan of anyone living connected the lives and actions of former generations to the present moment. It is in this process that we find patterns of entanglement and the conflation of boundaries and boundary marks. It is through this complex process of making, remaking, at times unmaking boundaries that the parish emerges as the principal social and political jurisdiction, which was, as I've hoped to show you today, was a complex and protracted process. So I'm going to draw to an end there. So thank you for listening, everybody out there.